Hello, how are you? It's me, your storyteller for sleepless nights, ready to dive into another monotonous tale from the boring History for Sleep series. Today, we explore a topic rarely illuminated by castle torches or mentioned in knightly sagas: mental health in the Middle Ages. Before we begin, turn off the lights, get comfortable on your soft pillow, and leave the modern world outside the door. If you enjoy what you hear, like and subscribe, but only if you want to. No pressure. In the comments, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. Now take a deep breath, relax, and let's embark on a journey to a time when the mind was as mysterious and frightening a territory as the dark forests that covered the continent. Imagine you're not lying in your comfortable bed with a spring mattress, but on a pile of dry straw, perhaps with a coarse cloth sack stuffed with the same straw as a pillow. The only light comes from a tallow candle, whose rancid smell permeates the cold and damp air of your small room. Outside, there's no distant hum of cars, but only the deep silence of the medieval night, broken only by the howling wind, the croaking of a frog, or perhaps the distant cry of a wild beast. It is in this setting that we try to explore something that didn't even have a name: your mental health. Today, you might open an app and meditate, book an online psychotherapy session, or simply search for your symptoms to find a community of people who feel the same way. But here, in this tangible darkness of the past, your mind is unexplored territory, a black box governed by forces you neither understand nor control. The very concept of mental health is a modern invention, a luxury born of centuries of scientific research, philosophy, and growing human empathy. In the Middle Ages, such a category did not exist. There was no clear division between mind, body, and soul. They were one, a single vessel that sailed through the world. If something was wrong with your thoughts, feelings, or behavior, the explanation wasn't sought in a chemical imbalance in the brain or childhood traumas. It was sought in the divine, in the demonic, or in the fluids that flowed through your veins. Your anxiety, that very feeling of tightness in your chest and constant fear, was not a generalized anxiety disorder. It was proof of weak faith, a divine punishment for hidden sins, or even worse, the whispering influence of a demon in your ear. Your depression, that heavy fog that turned getting out of your straw bed into a Herculean task, was not a clinical condition. It was acedia, spiritual laziness, a mortal sin that distanced your soul from God. Think about the language we use today. We talk about brain chemistry, neurotransmitters, processing trauma. These words are our tools, our conceptual scalpels for dissecting suffering. The medieval man or woman had none of this. Their tools were prayer, superstition, and tradition. The inner world was a direct reflection of the outer world, a cosmos filled with angels and demons, omens and miracles. A fierce storm was not a meteorological phenomenon, but the wrath of God. Similarly, a storm in your mind was not a psychological problem, but a spiritual battle unfolding in your soul. There was no psychologist to validate your feelings, only a priest to judge your actions and thoughts. He was the guardian of your sanity, the interpreter of your torment, and his diagnosis was rarely comforting. He might prescribe more prayers, a pilgrimage to a distant shrine, or perhaps an exorcism to cast out the malevolent entity nestled in your mind. Imagine this isolation. Today, loneliness is an epidemic, but it's online loneliness where relief is just a click away. In the Middle Ages, isolation was absolute. If your mind betrayed you, you were truly alone. Your community, bound by ties of survival and faith, could both provide support and become your greatest source of fear and persecution. Strange behavior, prolonged sadness, and unexplained outburst of anger could turn you from a neighbor into an outcast, from a friend into a suspect of witchcraft. There was no room for nuances here. The line between the saint who had divine visions and the madman muttering about demons was dangerously thin, and often depended more on your social status and the interpretation of the local clergy than on anything else. In this silence that preceded psychology, mental suffering was not a condition to be treated but a trial to be endured, a mystery to be feared, or a sin to be atoned for. And as you settle into your sheets, feel the weight of that silence, that lack of words, and be grateful for the vocabulary we have today to name our shadows. Now that you've grasped the void, the absence of language to describe inner storms, let's delve deeper into the only explanation your medieval ancestors had: the supernatural. Imagine your mind not as a complex neural network, but as a battlefield. This is not a metaphor. For the medieval person, it was a literal, tangible reality. Your soul was a valuable prize, and two great forces fought for it: God and the devil. Every thought, every impulse, every fleeting feeling was either a divine inspiration or a devilish temptation. In this dualistic universe, there was no neutral territory. Therefore, when your mind began to fail you, when it was filled with anxiety, despair, or strange intrusive images, the conclusion was obvious and terrifying. You were losing the battle. The enemy had many names: Satan, Lucifer, Beelzebub, a legion of lesser demons, and his tactics were insidious. Demons were believed to enter the world through sin, a common act of pride, a burst of envy, a fleeting lustful thought. All of these were not just moral failings, but open doors, invitations for invisible forces to enter and wreak havoc. Your suffering was not a disease, it was a symptom of spiritual contamination. Depression, or melancholy as it was then called, was often seen as the result of a demon whispering words of despair into your ear, convincing you that God had abandoned you and that salvation was impossible. Anxious thoughts, which today we might call obsessive-compulsive disorder, were considered direct injections of evil, blasphemous ideas planted by demons to test your faith and drive you to madness. This worldview turned inner life into a minefield. There was no safe place for reflection or introspection. To explore the depths of your psyche meant risking an encounter with something truly sinister. Priests and theologians of the time, such as Thomas Aquinas, wrote in detail about the ways demons could influence the human mind. They could manipulate the imagination, creating vivid, terrifying visions. They could influence passions, igniting anger or lust to uncontrollable proportions. They could even affect the physical body, causing seizures, paralysis, or sudden pains that seem to have no natural cause. When you see the world through this lens, every nervous tic, every sleepless night, every nightmare becomes a potential sign of demonic interference. The most extreme manifestation of this was possession. This was not just influence, it was a complete hostile takeover. A demon was believed to seize a person's body and mind, using them as a puppet. Stories of the possessed abounded in medieval folklore and hagiography, lives of saints. These unfortunate souls exhibited superhuman strength, spoke languages they had never learned, uttered blasphemies, and showed a violent aversion to holy objects such as crosses or holy water. For the community, the sight of a possessed person was both terrifying and instructive. It was living proof of the devil's existence and the consequences of sin. The treatment, of course, was not rest or therapy, but the rite of exorcism. The priest, armed with his faith and ritual prayers, engaged in direct confrontation with the demonic entity, attempting to cast it out of the victim's body. These rituals could be long, brutal, and psychologically draining for both the exorcist and the sufferer, who was likely already in a state of extreme mental distress. But it didn't always come to full possession. For most people, the link between sin and mental suffering was more subtle, but no less pervasive. This created a vicious cycle of guilt and shame. You felt depressed, so you believed it was punishment for sin. This belief made you feel even more guilty and worthless, which in turn worsened your depression. Breaking out of this spiral was practically impossible without external validation from a spiritual authority that you were forgiven. Confession was not just a religious rite, it was a crucial form of psychological release, the only available mechanism for lifting the burden of guilt that could literally drive one mad. So, as you fall asleep tonight, think about the ease with which we can separate our feelings from our moral judgments. Think about the freedom of not seeing a demon in every shadow of your soul, or a punishment in every suffering. This is a freedom your ancestors could not even hope for. While demons and sins were the primary explanation for mental torment, there was another parallel system of beliefs inherited not from the Bible but from the ancient Greeks and Romans. This was medicine based on the theory of the four humors or bodily fluids. Imagine your body as a vessel containing four main substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these fluids corresponded to one of the four elements: air, water, earth, fire, one of the seasons, and a specific set of qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. Your physical and mental health, according to this theory, depended on the ideal balance of these four humors. You were healthy when they were in harmony, but when one of the humors became excessive or deficient, Illness arose, and this applied to both the body and the mind. This system was elegant and comprehensive. It gave doctors, the few who existed and were mostly available to the wealthy, a coherent conceptual framework for diagnosis and treatment. Your character and temperament were also explained through the dominant humor. If blood predominated, hot and wet, you were sanguine, cheerful, optimistic, and outgoing. If phlegm dominated, cold and wet, you were phlegmatic, calm, slow, and apathetic. An excess of yellow bile, hot and dry, made you choleric, quick-tempered, ambitious, and irritable. And finally, if there was too much black bile, cold and dry in your body, you were melancholic, thoughtful, sad, and prone to depression. This was the first attempt in history to create a psychophysiological typology of personality. Now let's apply this to mental health. When you went to a medieval doctor complaining of what we would today call depression, he wouldn't ask about your relationships or childhood traumas. He would look at the color of your skin, check your pulse, perhaps examine your urine and feces. He would try to determine which humor was out of balance. Deep sadness, apathy, loss of appetite, and insomnia were clear signs of an excess of black bile. This cold, dry humor was believed to stagnate in the spleen, releasing dark vapors that rose to the brain, clouding thoughts and causing groundless sorrow. Your diagnosis would be melancholy, and this was not just a description of a mood, but a specific physiological condition. On the other hand, if you suffered from what we might call a manic episode, talking incessantly, full of grandiose ideas, staying awake for nights, and behaving recklessly, the doctor would see this as an excess of blood or yellow bile. Too much hot and wet blood rushing to the brain caused a condition known as phrenesis or mania. Your mind was literally overheating. You were too agitated, too energetic, and this was considered just as dangerous as the cold stagnation of melancholy. Treatment, accordingly, aimed to cool and dry your body to restore balance. This humoral theory was incredibly influential because it connected the inner world of a person, the microcosm, with the outer world, the macrocosm. The seasons, the weather, the position of the planets, and even the food you ate, all of these could affect your humoral balance. Spring, with its warmth and humidity, was believed to increase blood, making people more cheerful but also more prone to mania. Autumn, cold and dry, was associated with black bile, and consequently, with an increase in melancholic moods. Your diet was a crucial tool for maintaining balance. Foods were classified by their humoral properties. For example, if you suffered from melancholy, cold and dry, you might be prescribed a diet of hot and wet foods, such as lamb, wine, and wheat bread, and advised to avoid cold foods such as cucumbers or fish. This system may seem quaint and unscientific to us today, but it had its own logic. It offered a rational, natural explanation for suffering, an alternative to the demonic. It gave people a sense of control. If you could change your diet, move to a different climate, or undergo a medical procedure, you could actively influence your condition. However, this theory was also rigid and deterministic. Your temperament was largely predetermined by your innate humoral constitution, and as we shall see, the treatments based on this theory were often brutal and debilitating, sometimes doing more harm than good. As you lie in your perfectly tempered bed, think about what it must have been like to believe that your mood depended on the balance of 4 fluids, and that a sip of cold beer or a bowl of hot soup could change not only your body, but the very essence of your soul. Of all the conditions produced by the imbalance of the 4 humors, none captivated the medieval imagination as strongly as melancholy. It was not just a word for sadness. It was a diagnosis, a cultural phenomenon, and a source of both great suffering and, strangely, a certain prestige. Let's take some time to understand what it truly meant to be melancholic in those distant times. Imagine black bile, or melancholy in Greek, from which the name originates. It was the heaviest, coldest, and darkest of the 4 humors. It was believed to be produced in the spleen, and when in balance was responsible for stability and concentration. But when there was too much of it, or when it burned and became corrosive, it turned into a poison for the soul. The symptoms of melancholy were strikingly similar to what we today call clinical depression. Medieval texts describe sufferers gripped by a deep, unprovoked sadness. They lost interest in all activities that previously brought them joy. Food became tasteless. The world lost its colors. They were plagued by insomnia, or, conversely, by constant drowsiness and lethargy. But melancholy went beyond mere apathy. It bred fear, anxiety, and paranoia. A melancholic person might become reclusive, avoiding human company because they believed everyone hated them or was plotting against them. They might be obsessed with irrational fears, fear of death, fear of poverty, even the fear that they were made of glass and might shatter at the slightest touch. Doctors of the time tried to classify different types of melancholy. It was believed that it could arise naturally due to an excess of innate cold and dry black bile, but it could also be caused by the burning of other humors. For example, if yellow bile, hot and dry, overheated from anger or stress, it could turn into corrosive black bile, causing an agitated, anxious form of melancholy. If blood, hot and wet, stagnated and spoiled, it could also generate melancholic vapors. This meant that almost anyone, regardless of their innate temperament, could fall into this state under the influence of life circumstances, such as the loss of a loved one, financial ruin, or unrequited love. The treatment was as logical as the theory itself, and just as unpleasant. Since melancholy was cold and dry, the goal was to warm and moisten the patient's body and mind. Diet was the first step. The patient was prescribed hot and wet foods, young meat such as chicken or lamb, fresh eggs, good red wine, and white bread. They were advised to avoid anything cold, dry, and hard to digest: beef, rabbit, lentils, cabbage, and most root vegetables. These foods were believed to produce even more black bile. Besides diet, warm baths were recommended, often with the addition of softening herbs such as mallow or violet, to relax the body and open the pores. Light physical exercise, such as walks in pleasant company through a blooming garden, was also encouraged. However, if these gentle methods did not help, doctors moved on to more aggressive measures. To expel the excess black bile, strong laxatives and emetics were used, such as hellebore, a plant so poisonous that its use was extremely risky. And of course, there was bloodletting. Although this might seem illogical for a condition not associated with excess blood, doctors believed that removing bad or spoiled blood could help restore overall humoral balance. These procedures often left the patient weakened and dehydrated, which likely only worsened their sense of hopelessness. Interestingly, melancholy had a dual status. On the one hand, it was a severe suffering, associated with the sin of despair and the influence of Saturn, the darkest of planets. But on the other hand, especially in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it became associated with intellectual depth, creative genius, and spiritual sensitivity. This idea dated back to Aristotle, who wondered why all outstanding people, philosophers, poets, artists, and statesmen, were melancholic. It was believed that the same black bile that caused sorrow also sharpened the intellect and imagination. Thus, for a scholar, a monk, or an aristocrat, being melancholic could be a kind of mark of distinction, a testament to a refined and reflective nature. This romanticization of sadness created a strange paradox. A condition that could lead a commoner to exile or accusation of possession could give an aristocrat an aura of mysterious genius. As you slowly drift off to sleep, think about this duality. Think about how the same condition, deep sadness, could be both a curse and a sign of chosenness, depending on who you were and who judged you. If melancholy was a slow, cold descent into darkness, its fiery counterpart was frenzy and mania. These conditions were the complete opposite: not emptiness, but overflow; not cold, but heat; not silence, but unceasing noise. Imagine a person whose eyes gleam feverishly, whose cheeks are flushed, and whose speech is rapid and incoherent. They stay awake for days on end, driven by an indefatigable energy that seems superhuman. They harbor grandiose, unrealistic plans, speak of themselves with unwavering confidence, and easily fall into anger or euphoria. For the medieval observer, this was not just strange behavior. It was a clear sign that the person's mind was literally boiling. According to humoral theory, the cause of this condition was an excess of hot humors, blood or yellow bile. Blood, being inherently hot and wet, was associated with energy, optimism, and vitality. But its excess, especially if it was spoiled or too hot, could flood the brain, causing what doctors called phrenesis. This was an acute condition, often accompanied by fever, delirium, and severe agitation. The patient might not recognize loved ones, shout incoherent phrases, or show aggression. Phrenesis was often seen as a symptom of another illness, such as typhus or meningitis, but it could also be a psychiatric disorder on its own. Mania, on the other hand, was associated with an excess of yellow bile, a hot and dry humor. This made it a more caustic and irritable form of madness. If phrenesis was like a bubbling cauldron, mania was like a dry, furious fire. A person in a state of mania was not just energetic. They were angry, aggressive, and prone to violence. Medieval texts describe maniacs tearing their clothes, attacking passers-by, shouting curses. They were considered extremely dangerous, and often these were the people who were chained and kept confined to prevent them from harming themselves or others. The treatment for these hot insanities was a mirror image of the treatment for melancholy. If a melancholic person needed to be warmed and moistened, a frenetic or maniacal person needed to be cooled and dried. The first step was to place the patient in a cool, dark room to reduce external stimulation. Their diet consisted of cold and wet foods, cucumbers, melons, pumpkins, barley water, and fish. They were strictly forbidden from consuming wine, spices, and red meat, as these were believed to fuel the internal fire. Compresses soaked in vinegar or water with rose petals might be applied to the head to cool the brain. But, as with melancholy, if gentle methods yielded no results, more radical remedies were employed. Bloodletting was the primary treatment. The idea was to physically remove the excess hot blood from the body. Often a large amount of blood was taken from the patient, leading to weakness and fainting. While this could temporarily subdue a violent patient, it was actually just a consequence of physical exhaustion, not a cure. Purging procedures using laxatives and emetics were also widely used, but this time, cold. Herbs were chosen to cleanse the body of excess yellow bile. Interestingly, unlike melancholy, there was nothing romantic or prestigious about mania and phrenesis. No one saw signs of genius in unbridled rage or incoherent delirium. These states were frightening, destructive, and unequivocally pathological. They represented the loss of what was valued most: reason and self-control. A person in a state of mania was closer to a wild beast than to a civilized being. This also meant that the line between a medical condition and demonic possession was even more blurred here. Violent, aggressive behavior, superhuman strength, and blasphemies. All of these fit both the descriptions of mania and the descriptions of possession. Therefore, treatment was often carried out on two fronts. The doctor tried to cool the body, and the priest tried to cast out the demon. The patient found himself in the middle of a tug-of-war between medicine and religion, undergoing procedures that were tormenting for both body and spirit. As you lie in silence and peace, imagine this inner fire. Imagine your mind racing at a speed you cannot control, throwing out snippets of thoughts and images, burning away any possibility of rest or clarity. Imagine the fear of those around you and the brutal methods they would use to extinguish you. And now take a deep, slow breath and feel the coolness fill your lungs and let your mind slow down, sinking into the tranquility of sleep. In a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was as permeable as gauze, the primary diagnostician of the soul was not the physician, but the priest. If your body belonged to the natural world and humoral medicine, your soul, and thus your mind, were the jurisdiction of the church. For the ordinary peasant or townsman, who had neither the access nor the means to consult a learned doctor, the local parish priest was the first and last resort in matters of mental turmoil. He was a psychologist, psychiatrist, and social worker rolled into one, albeit operating with a completely different set of tools and beliefs. Imagine going to your priest tormented by intrusive, blasphemous thoughts or paralyzing sadness. He would not measure your pulse or examine your urine. Instead, he would listen to your confession, trying to penetrate the mysteries of your soul. His diagnostic process aimed to identify sin. Was your sadness caused by acedia, spiritual laziness, and despair in God's mercy? Were your disturbing visions the result of pride, a desire for special divine revelations? Or perhaps your condition was a direct punishment for some hidden misdeed, such as adultery or theft. The diagnosis was inherently a moral judgment. The treatment prescribed by the priest was also spiritual. It might include intensified prayers, recitation of psalms, fasting, and pilgrimage to shrines. These acts of piety were believed to purify the soul, strengthen faith, and ward off evil influences. Pilgrimage, in particular, was a powerful therapeutic tool. It removed a person from their usual, possibly toxic environment, gave them a clear purpose, and a long road for reflection and repentance. The journey to the relics of a saint, believed to cure a specific ailment, offered immense hope. The very belief in the possibility of miraculous healing could have a powerful placebo effect, alleviating suffering. However, when symptoms were more severe and did not respond to standard spiritual prescriptions, the priest might come to a more ominous conclusion. It was not just sin, but direct demonic interference. Here, his role changed from confessor to warrior exorcist. The distinction between severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and demonic possession was virtually indistinguishable to the medieval mind. Hallucinations, delusions, speaking in tongues, glossolalia, convulsions, aggressive behavior, all these were textbook signs of possession. The rite of exorcism was a formalized ritual, described in special books such as the Roman ritual. It was not just prayer, but a dramatic confrontation. The priest, vested in a stole, used holy water, a crucifix, and relics of saints to challenge the demon. He addressed the unclean spirit directly, ordering it in the name of Christ to name itself and leave the victim's body. These sessions could last for hours or even days, being incredibly draining for all involved. For a person already in a state of extreme mental stress, such an experience could be both cathartic and deeply traumatic. On the one hand, it provided an explanation for their suffering and offered a path to liberation. On the other hand, it confirmed that they were a passive victim of a terrifying external force and subjected them to an intense, frightening ritual. The role of the church was dual. On the one hand, it created a system in which mental suffering was stigmatized as a sign of sin or demonic influence, breeding guilt and fear. The accusation of possession could lead to ostracism and violence. But on the other hand, the church and its associated institutions, such as monasteries, were among the few places where sufferers could find some refuge and care. Monasteries often provided asylum to those rejected by society, offering them a structured, peaceful life filled with routine and prayer, which in itself could be therapeutic. The priest, despite his limited and often erroneous views, was the only person one could turn to with one's pain, and his intervention, whatever it was better than complete neglect. As you lie safely in your bed, think about the weight of this power. Imagine that one person, your priest, has the right to make the final verdict on the state of your soul. He can declare you either a sinner in need of repentance, a saint graced with visions, or a possessed person in need of exorcism. Your fate, your place in society, and your own self-understanding are in his hands. And now let go of that thought and feel the relief that today, the diagnosis of your soul is made only by yourself, in the quiet peace of your own consciousness. If the priest sought to heal the soul through prayer, the physician sought to mend the body through much more material and often brutal methods. At the core of his practice lay the same theory of humors, and the primary goal was to restore their fragile balance. And to do that, something needed to be removed from the body or something added to it. Imagine a medieval doctor who doesn't listen to your heart with a stethoscope or take your blood pressure, but gravely examines the color and consistency of your urine in a special glass vessel. This was one of the main diagnostic tools. In his view, urine was a mirror of the body's internal state, and its analysis could tell him everything about your humoral imbalance. Once the diagnosis was made, be it an excess of cold black bile in melancholy or hot blood in mania, treatment began, and the most common, universal, and revered method was bloodletting or phlebotomy. This practice was based on a simple idea. If there was too much bad humor in the body, and it was believed that excessive humors accumulated in the blood, then it simply needed to be released. Bloodletting was not just a treatment but a ritual, surrounded by complex rules. Doctors consulted astrological charts to choose a favorable day and hour for the procedure, as it was believed that the position of the planets and zodiac signs influenced different parts of the body. The procedure itself could be performed in several ways. The most common was venesection, where a vein, usually in the crook of the elbow, was opened with a lancet or scalpel, and blood flowed freely into a special bowl. The amount of blood released depended on the patient's age, build, and condition, but it was often significant, leading the person to faint. Another method was the use of leeches. They were applied to specific areas of the body, and they would suck out blood while simultaneously injecting anticoagulants contained in their saliva into the wound. A third method involved scarification and cupping. Small incisions were made on the skin, and a heated glass cup was placed over them. As the air inside cooled, it created a vacuum that drew blood from the incisions. For a patient suffering, say, from anxiety or panic, such an experience, the sight of their own blood, the pain, the weakness, was hardly comforting. Along with bloodletting, the second pillar of humoral therapy was purging. The idea was the same: to expel excessive or harmful humors from the body. Powerful emetics, vomit-inducing, and purgatives, laxatives, were used for this purpose. If the doctor believed the problem was an excessive phlegm in the head, he might prescribe sneezing remedies to expel it through the nose. If the problem was black bile, associated with the spleen and intestines, he would prescribe strong laxatives. These medicines were not gentle herbal concoctions, but often aggressive and poisonous substances, such as hellebore or scammony, which caused a violent and agonizing reaction in the body. The patient would spend hours, or even days, in agony, suffering from vomiting and diarrhea. This was believed to cleanse the body, but in reality, it led to severe dehydration and exhaustion, which was especially dangerous for an already weakened person. Diet, as we have already mentioned, was also a crucial part of treatment. It was not just a set of recommendations, but a strict system of prescriptions. Every food, every spice, every drink was classified according to its humoral properties. Treating a mental disorder might involve multi-page lists of allowed and forbidden foods. For example, a melancholic might be forbidden beef because it was considered a melancholic food that produced black bile, but allowed lark meat, which was considered light and warming. This obsession with diet turned every meal into a medical procedure, and likely added even more anxiety to the sufferer. Imagine this comprehensive approach. You suffer from deep depression. The priest tells you it's spiritual laziness. The doctor tells you it's an excess of cold and dry black bile. As a result, you are forced to fast and pray, and then your vein is opened to release bad blood. You're given a poisonous potion to induce vomiting, and you are put on a strict diet of chicken broth and white wine. Each of these treatments is agonizing in its own way, and exhausts your physical and mental strength. And all of this is done with full conviction that it is the only path to healing. As you lie in your bed, feeling only the softness of the sheets and the calm beating of your own heart, be grateful that you live in an age when healing the soul does not require physical torture. And the word cleansing is associated with spa treatments, not poisonous concoctions. Among all the terrifying treatment methods that medieval medicine could offer, none evokes such primal horror as trepanation. The very idea of willingly allowing someone to drill or scrape a hole in your skull while you are conscious seems unthinkable. Nevertheless, this procedure was a reality. It is one of the oldest surgical operations in human history, practiced thousands of years before the Middle Ages, and it survived into this era, shrouded in a mixture of superstition, mysticism, and desperate medical logic. Imagine a person suffering from unbearable headaches, epileptic seizures, or a severe mental disorder such as profound melancholy or mania. When bloodletting, laxatives, and prayers failed, despair could lead him or his family to a barber surgeon or an itinerant trepanation specialist. These were not highly educated doctors, but artisans whose knowledge was passed down by word of mouth and based on crude practice. Their instruments were simple and terrifying: drills, scrapers, saws, and chisels, more like carpentry tools than surgical ones. Why would anyone even think of opening the skull? The motivation was twofold, and it perfectly reflects the merging of magical and scientific thinking of the era. On the one hand, there was a supernatural explanation. If madness was believed to be caused by an evil spirit trapped inside the head, then the logical solution was to create an exit for it. By drilling a hole in the bone, the surgeon literally opened a door for the demon to escape. It was a physical form of exorcism, a crude and desperate attempt to release the evil. The patient, believing in this concept, could endure agonizing pain in the hope of spiritual liberation. On the other hand, there was also a humoral, more medical reason. Doctors believed that some forms of madness, especially those accompanied by headaches or a feeling of pressure, were caused by the accumulation of bad vapors or excessive humors inside the skull. Black bile could emit dark fumes, and blood, hot ones. These vapors pressed on the brain, causing pain, delirium, and convulsions. Trepanation in this context was seen as a way to relieve pressure. The hole in the skull was supposed to allow these harmful vapors to exit, similar to opening a valve on a boiling cauldron. This procedure was also applied to very real head injuries to remove bone fragments or blood clots after a blow, and perhaps its success in these cases encouraged its use for treating invisible internal ailments. The operation itself was a nightmare. Anesthesia, as we know it, did not exist. The patient might be given large amounts of wine or a tincture of opium or mandrake to dull the pain and consciousness, but this was far from complete analgesia. Most often, they were simply held firmly by several strong assistants. The surgeon began by cutting the scalp, exposing the bone. Then he proceeded to the slow and agonizing process of drilling or scraping. Bone dust flew everywhere. The sound of metal grinding on bone must have been unbearable. The surgeon had to work with extreme caution to avoid damaging the dura mater and the brain itself, which lay beneath the bone. One wrong move could lead to instant death, paralysis, or uncontrollable bleeding. If the patient survived the operation itself, the next ordeal awaited them: survival afterward. The concept of sterility did not exist. The instruments were dirty, the surgeon's hands unwashed. An open head wound was a gateway for infection. Many patients who survived the trepanation itself died a few days later from meningitis or sepsis. However, what is surprising is that some did survive. Archaeologists find skulls with traces of healed trepanation, proving that the bone around the hole had time to regenerate. This means that the person lived for many more months or even years after the operation. We will never know if this procedure relieved them of their original symptoms, or if they simply learned to live with a hole in their head and the constant fear of infection. As you lie in your bed, perhaps with a slight headache from a long day, think about this extreme remedy. Think about the level of despair that would lead you or your loved ones to agree to such torture. Feel the integrity of your skull, this bony armor protecting your most valuable organ. And be grateful that today, for treating pressure, whether physical or emotional, we have much gentler and more effective methods than a drill and a chisel. Not everyone who suffered from mental illness in the Middle Ages underwent exorcism or trepanation. Many simply continued to live, integrated into society, but on special, often humiliating terms. For those whose behavior was not so much dangerous as strange, eccentric, or simply incomprehensible, a special social role was reserved, that of the village idiot, or the town madman. These figures were an integral part of the medieval landscape, living reminders of the fragility of the human mind, and their lives were a mixture of relative freedom and constant humiliation. Imagine a marketplace on a busy day. Among the merchants shouting prices for their goods, the monks begging for alms, and the noble ladies making their way through the crowd, you notice a person dressed in rags, talking to himself, gesturing to invisible interlocutors, or suddenly starting to sing or dance. This is the idiot. Unlike violent maniacs who were chained, or melancholics who secluded themselves in their homes, these people often had freedom of movement. They roamed the streets, slept in barns or on church porches, and lived on alms and scraps of food thrown to them by compassionate or mocking townspeople. Their position in society was paradoxical. On the one hand, they were treated with a certain degree of superstitious reverence. In their incoherent speech, people sometimes tried to discern hidden prophecies or divine messages. There was a belief that the mad were under the special protection of God, that their minds were so simple and innocent that they could not commit sin. They were called les innocents in France, or God's people, elsewhere. This belief sometimes protected them from the worst violence. People might give them food or old clothes, considering it a pious act. But on the other hand, and much more often, they were objects of cruel mockery and ridicule. They were a constant source of entertainment for the bored crowd. Children ran after them, throwing stones and shouting insults. Adults might ply them with drink in a tavern to laugh at their drunken antics. Their oddities, their fears, their mutterings, all of it turned into street theater, a free show. They were living caricatures, walking jokes. This duality, between the sacred and the ridiculous, between compassion and cruelty, defined their existence. They were both part of the community and completely excluded from it. This publicity of suffering was the norm. In the Middle Ages, there was no concept of privacy in the modern sense. Life unfolded in plain sight. Birth, illness, death, all were public events, and madness was no exception. It was not hidden behind hospital walls, but displayed. This constant visibility also had a flip side. It meant that the community took some responsibility for its madmen. As long as they were not dangerous, they were allowed to exist. It was a form of informal, chaotic care, based not on medicine, but on a mixture of tolerance, superstition, and cruel entertainment. There was even the concept of the ship of fools, immortalized in art and literature of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. The idea was that cities sometimes rid themselves of their madmen by putting them on a boat and sending them downriver to another city. Historians debate whether this was a real practice or simply a powerful allegory, but the image itself speaks volumes. It shows a desire to cleanse society of disturbing elements to pass the problem on to someone else. It symbolizes the aimless, uncontrolled journey of those who had lost their minds, drifting through life rudderless. For a person suffering from a mental disorder, this public life would have been unbearable. Imagine that your deepest anxiety, your darkest thoughts, your strangest impulses are not just experienced internally, but played out on a stage before your entire village. Imagine having no place to hide, no moment of peace from the scrutinizing, judging, or mocking glances. Your suffering becomes another's entertainment, your pain a cause for laughter. As you lie in the privacy of your bedroom, in a space that belongs only to you, appreciate this luxury of privacy. Appreciate the right to experience your inner storms in silence, without having to turn them into a public spectacle. This is a right the village idiot never had. Not everyone who suffered from mental ailments remained on the streets. As cities grew and society became more complex, a need arose for more formal ways of managing those who were considered too violent, helpless, or simply inconvenient. Thus, the first specialized institutions began to appear: sanctuaries, asylums, and hospitals that admitted the mentally ill. However, their purpose was far from the modern concept of therapeutic treatment. These were places where care and confinement, compassion and control, were inextricably linked. One of the earliest and most famous such institutions was the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, founded in 1247. Originally, it was a monastery intended to collect alms for the Crusades and help the poor. But over time, by the end of the 14th century, it began to specialize in housing mad patients. Its name, Bethlehem, quickly corrupted in common parlance to Bedlam, a word that even today is synonymous with chaos, uproar, and madness. Bedlam became the archetype of the madhouse, a place that both attracted and horrified the public imagination. What were these early hospitals like? One should not imagine neat wards and caring staff. These were, in essence, hybrids of a prison, an almshouse, and a monastery. The primary function was containment, not treatment. The main task was to isolate the mad from society, to protect both themselves and others. Patients were admitted for various reasons. Some were placed there by their desperate families, who could no longer cope with them. Others were sent by urban authorities as disruptors of public order. Still others may have come themselves in search of refuge and food. Conditions in these institutions were, by our standards, horrifying. Patients were often kept in small, dirty cells. Sanitation was minimal. Food was meager and monotonous, usually bread, porridge, and weak beer. There was no structured treatment program. Care was limited to basic supervision. Violent patients might be shackled, chained to walls, or put in stocks. This measure was considered necessary for their own safety and to prevent violence. The idea that peace, comfort, and human interaction could be beneficial for mental health was completely alien. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to portray these places solely as torture chambers. They also contained an element of Christian charity. The very idea of creating a hospital to care for the sick and poor was an act of benevolence. The staff, often consisting of monks or nuns, believed that caring for the most unfortunate members of society was their religious duty. They provided patients with shelter and food, which was no small feat in a world where many starved. In some hospitals, especially those influenced by more humane traditions, such as in the Arab world or in some parts of Spain, patients were treated with greater kindness, using music, baths, and occupational therapy to calm them. However, in places like Bedlam, commercialization quickly supplanted charity. In the 16th, 17th centuries, the hospital became infamous for turning its patients into a tourist attraction. For a small fee, anyone could enter and gawk at the mad in their cells, like animals in a zoo. It was a popular London entertainment. Visitors came to laugh at the patients' delusions, to tease them, to poke them with sticks. This was an extreme manifestation of the same trend as with the village idiot. but on an institutionalized and commercialized scale. Suffering was transformed into a commodity, a spectacle for an idle public. Committing someone to such a hospital was, in essence, civil death. Patients lost all their rights and property. It was extremely difficult to leave. Even if a person's condition improved, their family might refuse to take them back due to shame or financial difficulties. For many, Bedlam and similar places became home for the rest of their lives. It was a place of oblivion, where society dumped those it could not or would not understand. As you lie in the quiet of your room in your personal sanctuary, think about the meaning of these walls. The walls of your bedroom give you privacy and security. The walls of Bedlam meant confinement and humiliation. Think about what it's like to have your most vulnerable state exhibited for public viewing for money. Feel grateful that today, the walls of treatment facilities, for all their shortcomings, are designed to protect the patient's dignity, not to turn them into an exhibit for the curious. And let that feeling of security carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Far from the university physicians with their Latin and astrological charts, and from the priests with their dogmas and rituals, there existed another world of healing. This was the world of village healers, herbalists, midwives, and wise women. These people were the keepers of ancient knowledge, passed down through generations, knowledge of the power of plants, roots, and minerals. For the vast majority of the population, who would never in their lives see a licensed doctor, these folk healers were the main hope for relief from bodily and mental ailments. Imagine a small hut on the outskirts of a village. Inside, the air smells thickly of dried herbs hanging in bunches from the rafters. Chamomile, valerian, St. John's wort, lavender. On the shelves are clay pots with ointments and tinctures. There are no leather-bound books here, only experience accumulated over years of observing nature and people. When anxiety kept you awake at night or a longing squeezed your heart, you didn't go to church or the city hospital, but here, to this woman who knew the secrets of the earth. Her approach was holistic and intuitive. She listened to your complaints but also observed you, your body, your eyes. Her diagnosis was based not on humoral theory, but on practical experience. The treatment she offered was aimed at calming, comforting, and restoring harmony. Instead of brutal bloodletting and poisonous laxatives, she used the gentle power of nature. You might be prescribed lime blossom or chamomile tea to calm your nerves and induce sleep. For severe anxiety or heart fluttering, what we would call a panic attack, the main remedy was valerian root, known for its sedative properties for centuries. St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum, was often used to treat melancholy and despondency. This herb, with its bright yellow flowers that release red juice when crushed, was associated with light and sun. It was believed to be able to drive away darkness from the soul. Today we know that St. John's wort contains active compounds, such as hypericin and hyperforin, which can act as a mild antidepressant, affecting neurotransmitter levels in the brain. The medieval herbalist didn't know these words, but she knew from experience that a decoction or tincture of this plant helped lift the spirits and restore interest in life. Besides decoctions and tinctures, other methods were widely used. Aromatic baths with added lavender, rosemary, or lemon balm were meant to relax the body and clear the mind. Compresses with calming herbs might be applied to the temples. Certain spices, such as nutmeg, which in small doses was considered a good remedy for sadness, were recommended to be added to food. Amulets and talismans were also used. A piece of root or a bag of herbs to be worn around the neck was not just a superstition. It gave the patient a tangible object on which to focus their faith and hope, acting as a powerful placebo and source of psychological comfort. However, the world of folk medicine was fraught with dangers. The line between healer and witch was incredibly thin and depended on many factors: the success of the treatment, the opinion of the local priest, rumors, and neighborhood prejudices. If the treatment was successful, the healer was revered. But if the patient died or if her method seemed too strange, she could be accused of witchcraft. The use of herbs that could be poisonous in large doses, the muttering of spells or incantations during the preparation of medicines, knowledge of abortion, all of these could be grounds for accusation. Many of these wise women, who possessed real knowledge in botany and pharmacology, ended their lives at the stake during the witch hunts that intensified in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. This fear of persecution meant that many healers worked in secret, passing their knowledge only to the most trusted students. Their world was a world of whispers, secrets, and intuition. It stood in sharp contrast to official male academic medicine, which was loud, dogmatic, and often ineffective. Folk medicine was gentler, more accessible, and perhaps more effective for treating mild and moderate mental disorders, as it offered what neither a doctor nor a priest could: empathy, time, and comfort born of nature itself. As you lie, ready for sleep, think about this hidden wisdom. Think about the knowledge that was almost lost, about the women who risked their lives to alleviate the suffering of others with leaves and flowers. Smell the imagined lavender or chamomile. Let this simple, natural calming fill your mind, carrying away the anxieties of the day and immersing you in a deep healing sleep. If humoral theory was an attempt to rationalize suffering, and folk medicine to soothe it, the pervasive belief in magic and superstition was the most powerful generator of anxiety and paranoia. In the medieval world, there was no clear line between the possible and the impossible. The world teemed with invisible forces: ghosts, fairies, goblins, and most terrifyingly, witches and sorcerers who could, by their evil will, inflict diseases, misfortunes, and madness. This fear was not just folklore. It was a real, tangible part of daily life that shaped people's thinking and behavior. Imagine you are an ordinary peasant. Your cow, a source of milk and wealth, suddenly falls ill and dies. Your crop perishes from an unknown disease. Your child suffers from a debilitating fever. In a world lacking scientific understanding of microbes, genetics, or weather cycles, it is very easy to conclude that this is no accident. It is the result of malicious intent. You start looking around. Who could have done this? Perhaps that old widow who lives on the outskirts and mutters to herself? Or the neighbor you recently argued with over a boundary line? Suspicion, once it takes root in the mind, begins to grow, poisoning relationships and breeding fear. Now transfer this mechanism to mental health. You start suffering from sudden panic attacks. You are tormented by nightmares, or you fall into deep depression after the death of a loved one. Instead of seeing this as a natural reaction to grief or stress, you or your loved ones could easily conclude that you were evil-eyed or cursed. Someone who wished you harm hired a sorcerer or performed a ritual themselves to inflict madness upon you. This belief was terrifying because it made you an absolutely helpless victim. Your suffering was not an internal process, but the result of an external, malevolent attack. This belief in witchcraft created fertile ground for the development of what we would today call paranoid ideas. Any sidelong glance, any careless word from a neighbor, could be interpreted as evidence of their evil intentions. People became obsessed with finding the source of their curse. They turned to white sorcerers or healers to help them identify the culprit and remove the curse. This often involved complex rituals, the use of amulets, counterspells. Sometimes it could lead to direct confrontation with the suspected witch, resulting in public accusations, quarrels, and violence. The witch hunt, which reached its peak in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, was the most terrible manifestation of this mass psychosis. Books like the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, provided theologians and inquisitors with a detailed guide to identifying, interrogating, and punishing witches. This book described in detail how witches made pacts with the devil, how they could cause disease, impotence, madness, and even death. Under torture, thousands of innocent people, mostly women, confessed to the most incredible crimes, confirming and strengthening existing superstitions. For a person already suffering from a mental disorder, this atmosphere was deadly dangerous. Their symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, convulsions, social isolation, perfectly matched the descriptions of witch behavior or possession. A woman suffering from postpartum depression might be accused of having swapped her child for a fairy changeling. A person with epilepsy might be accused of being possessed by a demon during a sabbat. Their illness became proof of their guilt. The fear and suspicion of society focused on its most vulnerable members, turning their suffering into a crime. Even if you weren't accused of witchcraft, life itself in this atmosphere was a source of constant stress. You had to constantly watch your words and actions so as not to arouse suspicion. You had to participate in protective rituals, hanging horseshoes over the door, wearing amulets, crossing yourself at the sight of a black cat. It was a world where danger lurked around every corner, not just in the form of hunger or disease, but also in the form of an invisible curse. This chronic anxiety, this constant expectation of trouble, could not but affect the mental well-being of entire generations. As you lie in your safe room, where the only invisible forces are radio waves carrying internet signals, think about this mental poison. Think about what it's like to live in a world where your neighbor can be a mortal enemy, and your own misfortune is proof of their guilt. Feel the tension dissipate as you realize you live in a world that, despite all its problems, has largely freed itself from the suffocating burden of superstition. Allow this feeling of relief to dissolve the lingering anxieties of the day and carry you into sleep. While the sufferings of monks were explained by spiritual struggle, the mental ailments of women were too often reduced to their biology, specifically to one mysterious and, as believed, restless organ, the womb. For centuries, from ancient Egypt and Greece through the Middle Ages and even later, the theory of the wandering womb, or hysteria, prevailed. This idea, one of the most enduring and harmful in the history of medicine, asserted that the womb was not merely an organ for carrying children, but a kind of living creature within a woman, capable of moving throughout her body and causing all sorts of physical and mental disorders. Imagine this concept. Inside you is an organ that, if it is displeased, for example, due to a lack of sexual life or pregnancy, can detach from its place and embark on a journey through the body. If it rises upward, it can compress the heart and lungs, causing choking, fainting, convulsions, and a feeling of panic. If it presses against the liver, it will cause fits of anger. If it reaches the head, it will cause headaches, dizziness, and madness. Virtually any symptom that could not be explained otherwise, from anxiety and insomnia to mood swings and loss of appetite, could be attributed to this internal wandering entity. This theory was not just a medical curiosity, it was a powerful tool for pathologizing female nature and reinforcing the patriarchal order. It implied that women were inherently unstable, irrational, and controlled by their reproductive system. Their emotions, their suffering, their complaints were not taken seriously as legitimate human experience, but dismissed as the whims of their womb. The diagnosis of hysteria, from the Greek hystera meaning womb, became a universal label for any woman who displayed too much emotion, challenged the authority of her husband or priest, or simply behaved in a way that deviated from strict social norms. The treatment for hysteria was as logical and humiliating as the theory itself. If the womb wandered because it was dry and sought moisture, it had to be lured back into place. Fumigations were used for this purpose. Smudging. The woman was made to sit over incense so that the pleasant smell rising from below would attract the womb downward. Simultaneously, foul-smelling substances, such as burnt horn or asafoetida, were held to her nose to deter the womb from the upper body. This was an attempt to literally lure and repel an organ with smells, as if it were a disobedient animal. The main cure for hysteria, however, was considered to be marriage and regular sexual life. Doctors, from Hippocrates to medieval authors, were convinced that the womb calmed down when it performed its natural function, receiving seed and carrying children. Therefore, young girls and widows suffering from symptoms of hysteria were strongly advised to marry as soon as possible. This prescription, of course, conveniently coincided with social norms that primarily viewed women as wives and mothers. Her health and well-being were directly linked to the fulfillment of her reproductive role. Besides hysteria, women's mental health was vulnerable for other reasons. Women were more prone to accusations of witchcraft. Their connection to birth and death, their knowledge of herbs, their role in preparing food, all of this made them suspicious in the eyes of a superstitious society. Furthermore, real biological processes such as the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause caused hormonal fluctuations that could indeed affect mood. However, in the absence of scientific understanding, these conditions were often interpreted as moral or spiritual weakness. A woman suffering from postpartum depression might be accused of lacking maternal love or even of being overcome by a demon. Thus, a woman in the Middle Ages was trapped. Her suffering was either reduced to the primitive and humiliating biology of a wandering womb, or demonized as a sign of witchcraft or sin. She had very little chance of being heard, understood, and having her pain treated with empathy as a human, rather than specifically female, problem. Her inner world was colonized and interpreted by men, doctors, theologians, husbands, who saw in it only a reflection of their own fears and prejudices. As you lie in your bed in a world where women, at least in theory, have the right to own their bodies and their minds, think about this centuries-old legacy. Think about the millions of women whose real sufferings, Depression, anxiety, trauma were dismissed as just hysteria. Feel the weight of this injustice, and then feel the relief that the word hysteria is largely removed from the medical lexicon today, remaining only a ghost from the past, a reminder of how long and hard it was for women to gain the right to their own voice and their own soul. Until now, we have talked about the mind of an individual, struggling with their inner demons, humors, or superstitions. But the medieval mind was shaped not only by personal troubles. It was constantly exposed to blows from collective traumas of epic scale, the main ones being war and plague. We, with our modern concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, understand that extreme, life-threatening events leave deep psychological scars. But in the Middle Ages, there was no such understanding. The sufferings caused by these disasters had no name, but they were ubiquitous and shaped the worldview of an entire era. Imagine living under conditions of almost constant war. The Middle Ages was not an era of peace, punctuated by rare conflicts. Rather, it was a state of incessant small-scale warfare, punctuated by rare periods of calm. Feudal lords constantly feuded with each other. Viking raids, and later those of the Mongols or Turks, held entire regions in fear. The 100 Years' War between England and France devastated lands for generations. For the common person, this meant a life of constant uncertainty and fear. At any moment, an enemy army could appear on the horizon. Your home could be burned, your cattle stolen, your crops trampled. You and your loved ones could be killed, maimed, or taken prisoner. Soldiers, of course, were at the forefront of this violence. They witnessed and participated in bloody battles, where people hacked each other with swords and axes. They saw death and terrible injuries up close. But unlike modern soldiers, they had no system of psychological support, no concept of combat trauma. Their experiences, nightmares, intrusive memories, bursts of anger, emotional numbness, were not seen as symptoms of illness. At best, it was considered cowardice or weakness. At worst, a sign of sin or possession. They were expected to simply deal with it, often with the help of alcohol or even more violence. But trauma was not limited to soldiers. The civilian population suffered no less. Imagine the horror of a siege. Hunger, disease, constant bombardment from catapults, the fear of an assault that would inevitably end in massacre and looting. Imagine seeing your neighbors and relatives killed before your eyes. These images did not disappear when the war ended. They remained in memory, poisoning dreams and generating chronic anxiety. People lived in a world where violence was the norm and safety a rare luxury. This could not but lead to a hardening of hearts, to fatalism, and to a constant expectation of the worst. And then, in the mid-14th century, a catastrophe arrived that overshadowed even the horrors of war: the Black Death. This pandemic of bubonic plague, which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, was an event of apocalyptic scale. It wiped out, according to various estimates, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of the continent. It was a trauma unlike any other. Imagine a world where people die in agony within a few days, where terrible black buboes appear on bodies, and death is almost inevitable, where you go to bed healthy and wake up to find your wife or child dead. The psychological impact of the Black Death was colossal. It shattered all the foundations of society. Family ties broke. Parents abandoned sick children, husbands their wives, for fear of contagion. Social order collapsed. There was no one to harvest crops, to bury the dead. The streets were littered with corpses. It seemed as if the end of the world had come, that God had turned away from humanity. This gave rise to mass hysteria and despair. Some sought salvation in extreme forms of religious piety, such as the flagellants, processions of penitent sinners who went from town to town, scourging themselves until they bled in the hope of appeasing an angry God. Others, on the contrary, indulged in unrestrained hedonism, living by the principle of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The consequences of this collective trauma were felt for decades. Art and literature of the period were obsessed with the theme of death. The genre of the danse macabre appeared, where skeletons, personifying death, led both kings and peasants to the grave, emphasizing universal equality in the face of doom. Preachers spoke of the sinfulness of the world and the imminent last judgment. The level of violence in society increased. Trust in authority, both secular and ecclesiastical, which proved powerless against the plague, was undermined. The world seemed random, cruel, and meaningless. This was fertile ground for melancholy, anxiety, and apocalyptic moods. As you lie in your bed in a world that, despite its own crises, possesses science, medicine, and global connection to combat pandemics, think about this absolute horror. Think about what it's like to live in a world where death is so omnipresent, unpredictable, and inexplicable. Feel the psychological weight of this trauma, this collective scar on the soul of Europe, and then feel that weight dissolve into the awareness of your own safety, in the quiet of your room, where the only dance is the slow dance of your breath, carrying you into sleep. In a society where human behavior was judged through the prism of sin and moral responsibility, how did the justice system deal with those who committed crimes but whose sanity was in doubt? The question of insanity is one of the most complex in modern jurisprudence, and its roots run deep in the Middle Ages. Even then, jurists and theologians understood that there was a difference between malicious intent and an act committed in a state of madness. However, determining this difference was incredibly difficult, and the approach to this issue was full of contradictions. The fundamental principle of medieval law, inherited from the Romans and the canon law of the Church, was that to commit a crime, two elements were necessary: the criminal act itself, actus reus, and the criminal intent, or evil will, mens rea. It was believed that a person deprived of reason, non compos mentis, was unable to form this criminal intent. Like a small child or an animal, they could not distinguish good from evil and, therefore, could not bear full moral and legal responsibility for their actions. In theory, this was a surprisingly humane and progressive principle. In practice, however, everything was much more complicated. First, there was no clear medical or legal definition of madness. How could a court determine if the accused was truly mad at the time of the crime, or if they were merely feigning to avoid punishment? There were no psychiatric examinations or diagnostic guidelines. The decision was often based on witness testimony, neighbors, family, the local priest. They would tell the court about the accused's behavior, whether they talked to themselves, behaved strangely, had had fits of rage in the past. This was, in essence, a trial based on reputation and rumors. Second, ideas about the causes of madness heavily influenced the court's decision. If the accused's madness was considered a natural state, congenital idiocy, or the result of illness or head injury, the court might show leniency. Such a person might be found innocent by reason of insanity. However, this did not mean they were set free. They might be entrusted to the care of their family, who would have to supervise them and be responsible for their future actions. Or they might be placed in a monastery or hospital such as Bedtime for lifelong confinement. This was less rehabilitation than isolation, but if there was a suspicion that the madness had a supernatural origin, that is, it was the result of demonic possession, the situation became much more dangerous for the accused. In this case, the crime was viewed not as the act of an insane person, but as the act of a demon using the person's body. And although the person themselves might be considered a victim, their body, defiled by evil, was subject to punishment. In some cases, the court might sentence such a person to be burned at the stake, viewing this as a way to purify the body with fire and destroy the demonic entity. In addition, there was the concept of temporary insanity. A person might commit a crime in a fit of rage, jealousy, or drunkenness. In these cases, courts were less inclined to show leniency. It was believed that the person was themselves to blame for bringing themselves to such a state, by succumbing to sinful passions or intemperance. Their mind was temporarily clouded, but they still bore responsibility for allowing it to happen. One of the most famous examples illustrating the complexity of this issue is the animal trials that sometimes occurred in the Middle Ages. A pig that had devoured a baby could be officially tried, sentenced to be hanged and executed in the town square. This seems absurd to us, but it shows how seriously medieval law regarded the act of crime itself and the need to restore broken order through ritual punishment, even if the culprit had no evil will in the human sense. Thus, the fate of the mad criminal in the Middle Ages was extremely unpredictable. It depended on many factors: the opinion of their neighbors, the interpretation of the causes of their madness, the mood of the local judge or lord. They could be pardoned and entrusted to care, or they could be brutally executed. The system tried to grasp the difference between guilt and illness, but its tools were too crude, and its worldview too permeated with superstition and fear. As you lie in your bed, in a legal system that, for all its flaws, has complex and detailed procedures for determining sanity, think about this lottery of medieval justice. Think about a person standing trial, whose fate depends not on objective evidence but on whether illness, sin, or the devil is seen in their eyes. Feel the relief of living in a world where, at least an attempt is made to separate justice from superstition, and let this feeling of order and predictability lull you to sleep. We have already mentioned Bedlam as one of the first institutions for the mentally ill, but let us now try to open its creaking gates and spend a few moments inside, using our imagination to recreate the sensory experience of this place. Forget about silence and peace. The first thing that would hit you upon entering Bedlam would be the sound. It would not just be noise, but a cacophony of human suffering. Imagine a continuous hum consisting of dozens of sounds overlapping. From one cell comes a monotonous murmur, from another incoherent shouts. Somewhere down the corridor, someone cries incessantly, while in the neighboring cell someone laughs with a wild, unprovoked laugh. From time to time, this soundscape is pierced by a furious scream or the sound of a body hitting a wooden door. And above it all, the clanging of chains, the creaking of rusty hinges, and the echo of overseers' footsteps on the stone floor. It was the sound of a mind breaking apart, amplified and reflected from the cold walls. Then, the smell. The air would be thick, heavy, and stale. Imagine the pungent mixture of unwashed bodies, dirty straw that served as both bedding and toilet, sour food, and dampness emanating from the stone walls. Sanitation was practically non-existent. Patients lived in their own filth. There was no ventilation. This pervasive stench was not just unpleasant, it was a symbol of the oblivion and humiliation in which these people lived. It clung to clothes, to skin, to hair, becoming an inseparable part of their existence. Now, sight. Your eyes, accustomed to daylight, would struggle to adapt to the dim light. The corridors were dark, and the cells were lit only by a faint light filtering through a small barred window high up near the ceiling. In this gloom you would discern human figures in various states. Some sat, staring blankly at the wall, immersed in their inner melancholy. Others paced their tiny cells like caged animals, their movements abrupt and unpredictable. You would see people in shackles, their wrists and ankles chafed raw. You would see nakedness, rags, emaciated bodies covered in sores and dirt. And of course you would see the eyes, empty, frightened, furious, or filled with such sorrow that words cannot describe. And finally, touch. You would feel the piercing cold emanating from the stone floors and walls, a cold that did not recede even in summer. You would feel the dampness, the humidity that permeated everything. The straw you had to sleep on would be hard, prickly, and often wet. The coarse fabric of your clothes, if any, would chafe your skin. And of course, there would be the sensation of constant physical confinement. The cramped cell, the weight of the chains, the rough touches of the overseers who did not mince words with the patients. Life in Bedlam was devoid of any structure beyond the most primitive. There was no therapy, no activities, nothing to occupy the mind or soothe the soul. The day consisted of endless hours of emptiness, interrupted only by the distribution of meager food. For many patients, this sensory and emotional deprivation, this constant overload of suffering likely only worsened their condition. The world narrowed to four walls, to the sounds and smells of despair. It was into this environment, as we have already said, that the public was admitted. Imagine this last, most humiliating layer of experience. You are in your most vulnerable, most pitiful state, and curious faces peer into your cell. They laugh, point at you, throw garbage at you. Your personal grief, your hell on earth, becomes their entertainment for a Sunday. This practice turned patients from people into objects, stripping them of the last shred of human dignity. Of course, it's important to remember that our view of Bedlam is shaped by later, reformist descriptions, and perhaps at some periods conditions were not so dreadful. There might have been moments of compassion, there might have been overseers who showed kindness. But the general picture emerging from historical evidence remains grim. Bedlam was less a hospital than a warehouse for people society wanted to forget. As you lie in your clean, quiet, and cozy bed, in complete safety and privacy, take a moment to truly appreciate this. Feel the softness of your sheets, the freshness of the air, the silence broken only by the peaceful sounds of the night. Think of Bedlam not as an abstract historical fact, but as a real, sensory experience. And let the contrast between your comfort and their suffering fill you with deep gratitude and carry you into a calm, serene sleep. While for the commoner, melancholy was at best a misfortune and at worst a sign of possession, in the circles of the nobility and the educated elite, it gradually acquired a completely different, almost glamorous hue. Starting from the late Middle Ages and flourishing in the Renaissance, melancholy became not just a disease but a fashionable pose, a sign of a refined nature, intellectual depth, and creative genius. Being melancholic became prestigious. This idea, as we have already mentioned, had ancient roots, dating back to Aristotle. But it was during this period that it was taken up and developed by humanists, poets, and artists. They rehabilitated black bile. If previously it was considered merely a cold and harmful waste product, now it began to be seen as a source of unique abilities. It was believed that the same humor which in excess caused pathological sadness, in moderation stimulated imagination, sharpened intellect, and made a person capable of deep reflections on the mysteries of life, death, and the universe. Saturn was considered the planetary patron of melancholics. In traditional astrology, it was an ominous planet, associated with old age, death, misfortunes, and hard labor. But humanists, such as Marsilio Ficino, reinterpreted its influence. Yes, Saturn brought difficulties and sorrow, but it also granted its children, scholars, philosophers, theologians, and artists, the ability to concentrate, contemplate, and grasp higher truths. Thus, melancholy became the sacred disease of intellectuals, a noble suffering that distinguished them from the mundane, mindless crowd. This melancholy vogue was reflected in art and literature. Look at Albrecht Dürer's famous engraving Melancholia. It depicts a winged female figure, embodying genius, sitting in thought amidst scattered scientific and artistic tools. Her gaze is fixed in the distance, her face full of sorrowful wisdom. She cannot create, paralyzed by her own reflection. This is an idealized portrait of the melancholic genius, suffering from their own greatness. In literature, characters appeared such as Shakespeare's Hamlet, the archetypal melancholic prince dressed in black, prone to philosophical monologues and reflections on the transience of being. Aristocrats and courtiers quickly adopted this trend. Displaying a melancholic mood became a sign of good taste. A young nobleman might strike a thoughtful pose, sigh without apparent reason, write sad poems about unrequited love, wear dark-colored clothes. This was a kind of role-playing, a way to show one's sensitivity, education, and distinction from rough, unpolished commoners. Melancholy became part of court etiquette, an indispensable attribute just like fencing or dancing skills. Of course, beneath this fashionable pose often lay genuine suffering. An aristocrat's life, despite outward prosperity, was full of stress, political intrigues, dynastic marriages, struggles for power and royal favor. Many noble people truly suffered from depression. However, the social context allowed them to clothe their suffering in an acceptable and even honorable form. They were not chained or made a mockery of. Instead, they were surrounded by doctors who prescribed expensive medicines, diets of exquisite foods, and entertainments such as music or hunting to disperse the black bile. Their sadness was glorified by poets, and their portraits were painted by artists. This double standard was striking. If a poor person stopped working due to apathy, they were called lazy and sinful. If an aristocrat secluded themselves in their castle, overcome by longing, they were considered a profound thinker. If a peasant woman said she heard voices, she might be considered a witch. If a noble woman or a nun claimed to have divine visions, she might be declared a saint. Social status was a powerful filter through which mental state was interpreted. It could turn the same illness into either a mark of shame or a sign of chosenness. This romanticization of sadness was available to very few. For millions of ordinary people whose lives were a hard struggle for survival, there was simply no time or money for melancholy. Their suffering was devoid of poetry. It was raw, crude, and often silent, because they had neither the language nor the audience to express it. As you lie in your bed, think about this power of social construct. Think about how the same human emotion, sadness, can be packaged in completely different wrappers depending on status, wealth, and education. Think about how fashion and culture can shape our perception of illness. And perhaps you will conclude that although today we speak the language of science, not humors, we are still not entirely free from the habit of judging a person's inner world by their outward position. And now let go of these complex thoughts, and let your mind find simplicity and peace in the approaching sleep. In a world devoid of psychotherapy and modern support systems, where did people find comfort and strength to cope with mental adversity? Despite all the horrors described above, demonization, brutal treatment, and social stigma, medieval society possessed two powerful inherent survival mechanisms: faith and community. These two forces were inextricably linked and for many served as the main anchor in the raging sea of life's adversities. Let's first talk about faith. We have already seen how religion could be a source of fear and guilt, linking suffering to sin and the devil, but it also had another much brighter side. For a person whose life was full of uncertainty, pain, and loss, faith provided a comprehensive system of meaning. It offered answers to the most agonizing questions. Why do we suffer? What happens after death? Is there a plan in all of this? Christianity taught that suffering was not meaningless chaos, but a test sent by God to purify the soul and strengthen faith. By imitating the sufferings of Christ and the saints, a person could give their pain a higher sacred meaning. Their personal tragedy became part of the great cosmic drama of salvation. This idea was incredibly comforting. It allowed one not just to passively endure pain, but to actively embrace it as part of one's spiritual path. Prayer was not just a ritual, but a form of direct communication with a higher power to whom one could entrust one's deepest fears and hopes. The lives of saints offered role models to imitate, stories of people who endured terrible torments but kept their faith and were rewarded with eternal life. The cult of the Virgin Mary, in particular, offered an image of a compassionate, merciful mother, a heavenly intercessor to whom one could turn with any sorrow. In a world where earthly justice was harsh and earthly rulers cruel, faith in ultimate divine justice and mercy offered immense hope. The second pillar was community. In the Middle Ages, people lived in closely knit, interdependent collectives. Whether it was a village, an urban parish, or a craft guild, individual existence was inconceivable outside the group. This close bond, which could be stifling and give rise to gossip and suspicion, was at the same time a powerful system of social support. When trouble struck, you were not alone. Neighbors helped each other during bad harvests, illness, or fire. This mutual aid was not just an act of goodwill, but a necessity for survival. In the context of mental health, this meant that a person suffering from grief or depression was surrounded by people. They were not sent to a therapist's office for a 50-minute session once a week. Their life was woven into the fabric of daily interactions. A neighbor might come by with a bowl of hot broth. Friends might invite them to work or to a tavern to distract them from gloomy thoughts. Participation in common rituals, church services, seasonal festivals, weddings, and funerals strengthened a sense of belonging and helped to overcome personal crises. These rituals structured time, gave life rhythm, and reminded the person that they were part of something greater than their own suffering. Of course, this support was not always ideal. As we have seen, the community could also be cruel, turning the idiot into an object of mockery or exiling the witch. But in many cases, it was these informal support networks that saved people from complete despair. The family, despite all internal conflicts, remained the primary unit of society. The duty to care for one's sick and elderly members was sacred. Even in the case of Bedlam, many patients were housed there at the expense of their families or parishes, which indicates that they were not simply thrown out onto the streets. These two pillars, faith and community, worked together. The church was not just a building for prayer, it was the center of community life. Here people were baptized, married, and buried. Here they gathered for holidays. The priest was not only a spiritual but also a community leader. Faith gave people a common language, common values, and common rituals that united them into a single whole. This system offered what is so often lacking in our modern, individualistic society: a sense of deep-rootedness, belonging, and shared meaning. As you lie in your bed, perhaps feeling lonely in your nightly anxieties, think about this power of collective support. Imagine a world where your grief is shared by the entire village, and your pain has its place in the great divine plan. Perhaps we have traded this rootedness for personal freedom and scientific progress. This is neither good nor bad. It is simply a different way of life. But perhaps there is something in this medieval model that we could learn from, about the importance of human connections, shared rituals, and the search for meaning beyond our own self. And now let this thought of unity and support bring you comfort and peace, carrying you into serene sleep. In a world permeated by belief in the supernatural, unusual mental states were not always a sign of illness or possession. Sometimes they could be interpreted as a sign of divine chosenness. A person who heard voices, saw visions, and experienced states of ecstasy could find themselves at a crossroads. They could be declared either a dangerous madman or a holy prophet. The line separating these two paths was incredibly thin, blurred, and often depended not so much on the experience itself as on its content and on who interpreted it. Imagine two women living in the same town at the same time. Both begin to behave strangely. They refuse food, spending days in strict fasting. They spend hours in motionless prayer, often falling into a trance. Both claim to see angels and saints, and to hear the voice of God or the Virgin Mary, who reveals secrets and gives them instructions. From the perspective of modern psychiatry, both could be diagnosed with psychosis, anorexia, or temporal lobe epilepsy. But in the Middle Ages, their fates could be completely different. The fate of the first woman, let's call her Joan, turns out tragically. The content of her visions seems suspicious to the local priest. She speaks of things that contradict church doctrine or criticizes the clergy. Her behavior is too eccentric, too public. Her ecstasy looks more like a seizure. The priest and the community conclude that her visions do not come from God but from the devil, who has taken the form of an angel of light to deceive her and sow heresy. She begins to be considered possessed or a witch. She is subjected to exorcism, and if that doesn't help, she may be imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately executed. Her experience was classified as madness. The second woman, let's call her Catherine, has a completely different fate. Her visions are entirely consistent with Orthodox theology. She speaks of the love of Christ, the need for repentance and obedience to the Church. Her spiritual mentor becomes an influential and respected priest or monk who believes in the authenticity of her mystical experience. He records her revelations, spreads them, and defends her from critics. Her asceticism and ecstatic states are seen not as symptoms of illness, but as proofs of her holiness, her complete unity with God. Followers gather around her. After her death, she begins to be revered. Testimonies of miracles performed through her prayers are collected, and ultimately the Church canonizes her. Her very same experience was classified as sanctity. What determined which path a person would take? There were several key factors. First, the content of the revelations. They had to be beneficial for the soul and not contradict the Church's teachings. Any deviation aroused suspicion. Second, the personality of the mystic herself. Humility, obedience, and piety were mandatory. If a person showed pride, boasted about their visions, or challenged the ecclesiastical hierarchy, they were quickly declared an impostor. Third, and perhaps most important, the support of an authoritative spiritual figure. Without an influential patron who could vouch for the authenticity of the mystical experience, the chances of recognition were negligible. And finally, social status and gender also played a role. It was easier for a male priest to gain recognition than for a laywoman. History is full of such examples. Marjorie Kemp, a 15th century English laywoman, balanced on this edge her entire life. She wept and cried loudly during church services, claimed to have direct conversations with Christ, and wore white clothes as a sign of her purity. Many considered her mad or a heretic. She was repeatedly arrested and interrogated, but she always managed to convince church authorities of her orthodoxy, and eventually she dictated the first autobiography in the English language, detailing her spiritual journey. At the same time, countless others, less fortunate or less eloquent, ended their lives in confinement or at the stake for far lesser crimes. This thin line between mysticism and madness shows how strongly social and cultural context shapes our understanding of reality. An experience that in one context is considered a pathology, in another can be a supreme spiritual achievement. It also emphasizes the enormous power the Church wielded, the power to determine whose voice came from God and whose from the devil. For a person experiencing unusual mental states, this was a game with incredibly high stakes. They could become either a revered saint or a despised outcast, and often this depended not on themselves, but on the interpretation of their experience by others. As you lie in your bed, In a world where voices and visions are almost always considered symptoms requiring medical intervention, think about this lost opportunity. Think about a world where an unusual experience could be not only an illness, but also a gift. This does not mean we should romanticize psychosis, but it reminds us that reality is not as unambiguous as we sometimes think, and that the line between madness and genius, between illness and insight, has always been and remains dangerously thin. And now let your mind rest from these paradoxes and sink into the simple and clear world of sleep. We have spoken much about dramatic events, plague, wars, witch hunts, but for most people, mental health was not eroded by great catastrophes, but by the slow, monotonous pressure of everyday life. Let's forget for a moment about humoral theories and demons and look at an ordinary day of a medieval peasant or artisan through the prism of modern concepts of stress, burnout, and the influence of the environment on well-being. Imagine the physical strain. For more than 90% of the population, life was synonymous with hard, exhausting physical labor. From dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, you worked in the field using primitive tools. You plowed the land behind an ox, sowed by hand, reaped with a sickle, bending double under the scorching sun. In winter you cut wood, repaired tools, cared for livestock. Your body constantly ached. Chronic back pain, joint pain, calluses on your hands. This was the norm. Constant physical exhaustion could not but affect the mental state, leading to apathy, irritability, and a sense of hopelessness. There were no vacations, sick leaves, or pensions. You worked as long as you could stand on your feet. Now add diet to that. Your diet was meager and monotonous. The staple food was coarse bread and pottage, a thick stew of grain, beans, and whatever could be found. Meat was a rare luxury. Fresh vegetables and fruits were only available in season. Due to poor food storage and lack of vitamins, many suffered from chronic diseases, such as scurvy or skin diseases. Lack of nutrients, especially those important for brain function, such as omega-3 fatty acids or B vitamins, inevitably affected mood and cognitive functions, contributing to the development of depressive states. Next, the sensory environment. We often romanticize simple life in nature, but the medieval village was far from an idyll. Imagine the constant smell of manure, smoke, and filth. Dwellings were dark, cramped, smoky, and often overcrowded. You lived in one room not only with your entire large family, but sometimes also with livestock. Personal space virtually did not exist. Constant noise, lack of privacy, and basic comfort created an environment that constantly kept the nervous system on edge. But perhaps the most powerful source of stress was the complete dependence and lack of control over one's own life. If you were a peasant, you were tied to the land belonging to the feudal lord. You were obliged to give him a significant part of your harvest and to perform corvée labor in his fields. You had no freedom of movement. Your life and well-being depended on the whim of the Lord, on the weather, on the harvest. A single bad harvest year could mean starvation for your entire family. This feeling of powerlessness, the inability to plan for the future, and the constant threat of poverty and hunger created a background of chronic anxiety that permeated all existence. For the urban craftsman, life was slightly different but no less stressful. He was bound by the strict rules of his guild, which regulated everything, from product prices to working hours. Competition was fierce. The risk of ruin was great. Cities were overcrowded, suffered from unsanitary conditions, and were breeding grounds for diseases. In this context, many symptoms of mental disorders can be viewed as quite understandable reactions to unbearable living conditions. Apathy and despondency were a natural consequence of exhaustion and hopelessness. Bursts of anger and violence could be the result of constant stress, cramped conditions, and a sense of injustice. Belief in the supernatural and fatalism were ways to cope with a world that seemed absolutely unpredictable and uncontrollable. The medieval person did not think in terms of burnout or work-related stress, but they undoubtedly experienced these states. Their suffering had no name, but it was inscribed in their tired body and reflected in their gaze. This was the quiet, unheroic struggle that millions of people waged every day of their lives simply to survive. As you lie in your bed, think about the weight of this daily existence. Think about how our understanding of the link between living conditions and mental health has changed. We talk about work-life balance, ergonomics, the importance of rest, concepts that would have been completely alien to a medieval peasant. Feel grateful for the level of comfort, safety, and personal control you have. And let this feeling of relief become a bridge to a world where there is no hard labor or exhausting struggle, to a world of deep sleep. We often imagine childhood as a time of innocence, play, and carefree living. But this romantic concept is a relatively recent invention. In the Middle Ages, childhood was short, dangerous, and permeated by the same fears and anxieties as the adult world. A child's mental health was formed in conditions that today we would consider traumatic, and their inner world was populated not only by fairies, but also by very real demons. First, the very likelihood of surviving to adulthood was low. Child mortality rates were terrifyingly high. Diseases that are easily curable today, measles, diphtheria, diarrhea, claimed the lives of thousands of children. Almost every family experienced the loss of one or more children. A child grew up in a world where death was a constant companion. They saw their siblings die. They participated in funeral rituals. This early encounter with the transience of existence could not but leave a deep mark on their psyche, generating fears and anxieties related to death and loss. Secondly, childhood was very short. By the age of 7, a child was no longer considered an infant and entered the adult world. They began to be prepared for their future role. Boys from peasant families started helping their fathers in the field, and girls their mothers with household chores. In artisan families, children were sent into apprenticeship, where they lived and worked away from home, often in harsh conditions. They were expected to take on adult responsibilities and endurance. Games and entertainment, of course, existed, but they occupied much less space in a child's life than hard labor. This early maturation deprived children of the opportunity to gradually develop their emotional and social skills, throwing them into a world of adult concerns for which they were unprepared. Corporal punishment was the norm, and was considered an integral part of upbringing. The saying, "spare the rod and spoil the child," was not just words, but a guide to action. Children were whipped at home, at school, in an apprentice's workshop. It was believed that this was necessary to cast out the child's innate sinfulness and teach them obedience. This culture of violence created an atmosphere of fear and suppression. A child learned to hide their feelings, not to contradict elders, and to fear punishment for the slightest transgression. This did not foster the development of healthy self-esteem and emotional openness. But perhaps the most powerful factor shaping the child's mind was the fear of the supernatural. Adults believed in demons, witches, and ghosts, and these beliefs were passed down to children in the most vivid form. Lullabies and fairy tales, which we today consider sweet, were in their original versions full of violence and horrors. They were not so much entertainment as warnings about real and imaginary dangers. A child was told about wood spirits who dragged disobedient children into the forest, about witches who stole babies, and about demons who could possess the soul if one did not pray. Imagine a night in a medieval home. Darkness was absolute, lighting minimal. Every creak, every rustle outside the window could be interpreted as the approach of something sinister. A child's imagination, fueled by terrifying stories, painted horrible pictures. Night fears, which many children experience, in this context, acquired monstrous reality. The fear of darkness was not just a childish whim, but a fear of real, tangible evil that was believed to lurk in the shadows. Religious upbringing was also full of terrifying images. Children were told from an early age about the Last Judgment, about the torments of hell that awaited sinners. On church walls, they saw vivid and naturalistic images of devils tormenting souls in hell. The idea that every misdeed they committed was watched by an all-seeing God, and that the devil was always nearby, tempting them to sin, created enormous psychological pressure. The child lived with a constant feeling of guilt and fear of divine punishment. Thus, the inner world of the medieval child was a battlefield between innocence and fear, between the desire to play and the necessity to work, between belief in miracles and terror of demons. They had few tools to cope with these contradictions. Their fears and anxieties were rarely taken seriously by adults. Most often they were dismissed or punished. It was a childhood devoid of psychological safety, a childhood that prepared a person not for happiness, but for survival in a cruel and unpredictable world. As you lie in your bed, in a world where we have created an entire science of child psychology, where we strive to protect children from trauma and talk about the importance of a safe and loving environment, think about these little adults of the Middle Ages. Think about a child falling asleep to stories of demons and hellfire. Feel the relief that we have learned, at least, to try to protect childhood, and let this feeling of security carry you into a calm and serene sleep, such as rarely fell to the lot of children of that distant era. If childhood in the Middle Ages was short, old age was a luxury available to few. The average life expectancy was low, around 30-35 years, but this figure is misleading due to the enormous child mortality. One who survived the dangerous childhood years, plague and wars, could well live to 50, 60, or even 70 years. However, old age in that era was not a golden age of deserved rest, but a period of vulnerability, loss, and struggle for survival, which created unique challenges for mental health. Physical decline was the main reality of old age. After decades of exhausting labor, the body was worn out. Chronic pain, arthritis, tooth loss, weakening eyesight and hearing, all of this was an inevitable part of aging. In the absence of effective medicine, these ailments were not treated but merely patiently endured. Constant pain and physical discomfort were a powerful source of depression and apathy. A person who had defined themselves throughout their life through their ability to work, lost their identity and became a burden to their family. The social status of an elderly person was dual. On the one hand, old age was associated with wisdom and experience. Elders were the guardians of traditions, knowledge, and family history. Their advice might be listened to, their opinion respected. Ideally, elderly parents lived with their children's families surrounded by care and honor. But in practice, things were often different. In poor families where every mouth counted, an old person who could no longer work became an economic burden. This created family tension and a sense of worthlessness in the elderly person. Loss was a constant companion of old age. A person who lived to an advanced age outlived most of their peers. They buried many of their friends, siblings, and often their spouse or even children. This burden of losses accumulated, leading to a deep sense of loneliness and grief. The world they knew was fading into the past, and they were left alone with their memories. This social isolation was fertile ground for melancholy. From a cognitive perspective, what we today call dementia or Alzheimer's disease was perceived quite differently in the Middle Ages. Gradual memory loss, confusion, changes in behavior. All of this was not considered a brain disease. This state was often called falling into childhood or second childhood. An elderly person suffering from senile dementia might be treated condescendingly, like an unreasonable child. Their words and actions were not taken seriously. However, there was a darker side. If an elderly person's behavior became too strange, eccentric, or irritating, they might be considered not just senile, but possessed or even a sorcerer. Elderly women, especially widows, were particularly vulnerable. A lonely, poor old woman who lived on the outskirts of the village, muttering to herself, perhaps due to loneliness or cognitive impairments, and knowing about herbs, perfectly fit the stereotypical image of a witch. Many of those accused of witchcraft during the Great Witch Hunt were precisely such elderly, socially isolated women. Their age and mental state made them easy targets for the fears and superstitions of society. The main psychological task of old age was preparation for death. The entire life of a medieval Christian was a preparation for a good death, ars moriendi. It was believed that in the last hours of a person's life at their deathbed, a final battle for their soul unfolded between angels and demons. Demons tempted the dying with despair, disbelief, impatience, pride, and avarice. The task of the dying person and their loved ones was to help them resist these temptations and die in a state of repentance, faith, and hope of salvation. There were entire guides, The Art of Dying, that described this process in detail. This focus on death created enormous existential pressure. The fear of hellish torment was very real. The elderly person constantly replayed their past sins in their memory, worrying about their posthumous judgment. This anxiety could be tormenting. On the other hand, faith also offered comfort, the hope for paradise, for reunion with deceased loved ones, and for deliverance from earthly suffering was a powerful source of strength. Thus, old age in the Middle Ages was a period of paradoxes. It was a time of respect and burden, wisdom and dementia, fear of hell, and hope for paradise. The mental state of an elderly person depended on a fragile balance between physical health, family and community support, and their own spiritual resilience. As you lie in your bed, in a society that tries, though not always successfully, to provide elderly people with medical care, financial support, and a dignified life. Think about this last, difficult stage of the medieval journey. Think about the old man sitting by the hearth struggling with pain, loneliness, and fear of eternity. Feel the fragility of life and the inevitability of its sunset. And let this thought not frighten you, but on the contrary, bring you peace. The peace of acceptance and gratitude for every day lived. Let it carry you into a deep, restorative sleep. Our long and somber journey through the medieval mind comes to an end. We have seen a world governed by humors, demons, and fear. But history does not stand still. By the end of the 15th and into the 16th century, profound changes began to occur in Europe that marked the decline of the Middle Ages and the beginning of a new era, the Renaissance. These changes, cultural, scientific, religious, and social, did not instantly alter the lives of the mentally ill, but they sowed the seeds of a completely new perspective on man, his body, and his mind. One of the key shifts was humanism. Renaissance philosophers and scholars such as Petrarch, Erasmus of Rotterdam, and Thomas More turned their gaze from exclusively theological questions to the study of man himself. They rediscovered and translated the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors, admiring their focus on human reason, dignity, and potential. This new anthropocentrism, the view of man as the measure of all things, began to slowly displace medieval theocentrism. Man was no longer seen solely as a fallen, sinful creature in need of salvation, but began to be perceived as a complex creation worthy of study and admiration. This shift had important implications for understanding the psyche. If in the Middle Ages the mind was a battlefield between God and the devil, humanists began to seek more natural explanations for its workings. Although the theory of humors still dominated, it began to be approached with a greater degree of scientific curiosity, rather than blind faith. Thinkers emerged who tried to link mental states with the workings of the brain and nervous system. The Spanish physician Juan Luis Vives, sometimes called the father of modern psychology, in his works in the early 16th century, called for humane treatment of the mentally ill and emphasized the importance of empirical observation rather than theological speculation. He argued that it was society's duty to care for its poor and sick members, and suggested organizing occupational therapy for them. Another powerful catalyst for change was Gutenberg's invention of printing in the mid-15th century. Knowledge that had previously been accessible only to a narrow circle of monks and scholars who copied books by hand could now spread quickly and widely. This led to an explosive growth in literacy and education. Medical texts, both ancient and contemporary, became more accessible, fostering the exchange of ideas and a critical reevaluation of old dogmas. The scientific revolution, which began in the 16th to 17th centuries, dealt a devastating blow to magical thinking. The works of Copernicus, Galileo, and later Newton showed that the universe is governed not by the whims of supernatural forces, but by comprehensible, mathematical laws. This new scientific method, based on observation, experiment, and logic, gradually began to be applied to the study of the human body. Andreas Vesalius, the father of modern anatomy, in his work De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, challenged centuries of Galenic misconceptions, basing his conclusions on actual human dissections. This was a revolutionary step. The study of the body ceased to be sinful and became scientific. Understanding the anatomy and physiology of the brain, though in its infancy, paved the way for a biological rather than supernatural understanding of mental illnesses. The Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, also played its part. By splitting the unity of Western Christianity, it undermined the Catholic Church's monopoly on truth. Although Protestants were no less superstitious and witch hunts even intensified in some Protestant regions, the very fact of different religious views contributed to the development of critical thinking. Furthermore, the closure of monasteries in many Protestant countries led to the care of the poor and sick, shifting from the church to secular urban authorities, laying the groundwork for a future public health system. It is important to understand that these changes were very slow and uneven. For the average person suffering from depression or psychosis in the 16th century, life was not much better than in the 14th. They could still be chained, accused of possession, or made a mockery of. Old beliefs and new ideas intertwined strangely. Renaissance doctors might read Vesalius yet continue to draw astrological charts for diagnosis. Nevertheless, the foundation of the medieval worldview was irreversibly undermined. The door was opened for a new approach, an approach that viewed madness not as a moral or spiritual failure, but as an illness that could be studied, classified, and perhaps someday treated. The era of faith slowly gave way to the era of reason. It was not yet the end of darkness, but it was undoubtedly the end of the beginning. As you lie, ready for sleep, think about this great turning point. Think about how one idea, one invention, one bold discovery can set off a chain reaction that changes the world. Feel the tension of the old world, full of demons and dogmas, begin to ease, giving way to a new, brighter, though no less complex horizon. Let this feeling of slow but steady progress, this sense of dawn, carry you into a deep and peaceful sleep. Our long journey through the labyrinths of the medieval mind is almost complete. We have emerged from the darkness and stand on the threshold of our own time. It seems that an insurmountable chasm lies between the world of humoral theory and the world of neurotransmitters. We have replaced exorcism with psychotherapy, trepanation with antidepressants, and bedlam with modern clinics. But how far have we truly come? If you listen closely, you can hear how ancient beliefs and prejudices still echo in our attitudes towards mental health. These medieval ghosts still wander the corridors of our seemingly enlightened age. Take, for example, stigma. In the Middle Ages, madness was considered a sign of moral weakness, sin, or divine punishment. Today, we use different language, but the essence often remains the same. How many times have you heard someone tell a depressed person, "Just pull yourself together, stop moping," or "You just need to think positively"? These phrases are a direct descendant of the medieval belief that mental suffering is a matter of willpower, not a real illness. We may no longer speak of laziness as the mortal sin of acedia, but we still condemn apathy and lack of productivity, which are symptoms of depression, as a personal failing rather than a manifestation of illness. The idea that mental disorders are not real illnesses, unlike cancer or diabetes, is also a legacy of the past. This is an echo of the dualism of soul and body that was so important to medieval thought. We still struggle to accept that the mind is a product of the brain, a physical organ, and that malfunctions in its chemistry or structure are as real as a broken bone. This internal division causes many people to be ashamed of their diagnosis, to hide it from friends and employers, fearing judgment and discrimination. This fear is a direct descendant of the fear of being labeled mad or possessed. Our obsession with finding simple, universal causes for complex mental states is another ghost from the past. Medieval doctors reduced everything to an imbalance of four fluids. Today we sometimes fall into similar reductionism, trying to explain all depressions as a serotonin imbalance. While brain chemistry certainly plays a huge role, we risk ignoring the complex interaction of genetic, social, psychological, and environmental factors. Just as the 14th century doctor ignored the patient's personal history, focusing solely on their humors. Even our attitude towards treatment bears the imprint of the past. The search for a magic pill that will quickly and effortlessly solve all problems resembles the belief in amulets or miraculous potions. On the other hand, distrust of psychiatric drugs, fear of their side effects, and fear of getting hooked on them. This is a modern echo of the fear of poisonous concoctions and remedies of medieval healers. Gender stereotypes, which we saw in the theory of the wandering womb, have also not completely disappeared. Women's emotional expressions are still more likely to be dismissed as hormones or hysteria, while male depression is often masked as anger or aggression, because showing sadness is still considered unmanly. This is a direct legacy of a world where women's suffering was pathologized and men's was ignored or condemned as weakness. Of course, we have made huge progress. Science has given us tools and understanding that medieval man could not even dream of. The concept of human rights protects patients from the most egregious forms of cruelty. But the ghosts of the past are strong. They live in our language, in our jokes, in our subconscious fears and prejudices. They remind us that the struggle for a humane and reasonable approach to mental health is a long and continuous process. Every time we show empathy to a suffering person, when we fight stigma, when we recognize the complexity of the human mind, we cast out one of these medieval ghosts, making our world a little brighter and safer place for all. Our long and hopefully sufficiently boring journey has come to an end. We have passed through the dark ages, looked into the eyes of fear, despair, and madness. We have seen how humanity, over centuries, tried to find meaning in suffering, using the few tools at its disposal: faith, herbs, rituals, And alas, chains. Now mentally return to your room, to your bed. Feel the weight of your body on the soft mattress. Feel the even warmth of your blanket. Listen to the silence. All the horrors we spoke of, the Black Death, Bedlam, the witch hunts, are far in the past, having turned into ink on the pages of books and a monotonous voice in your headphones. Your own anxieties and worries, however great they may seem in the light of day, might now appear slightly less frightening in comparison to the weight of centuries. You live in an era that, despite all its shortcomings, has granted you an unthinkable luxury, the right to your own mind, to your own feelings, to seek help without fear of being judged as a sinner or a heretic. Let this thought bring you a deep sense of peace and gratitude. Breathe slowly and deeply. With each exhale, release the tension of the day. Let go of thoughts of the past and future. There is nothing to do. There is nothing to solve. There is only this moment, this silence, this slow descent into sleep. Let the darkness behind your eyelids be not frightening but comforting, like an old soft blanket. Let your mind rest,